Good morning from England. Good afternoon from England. What am I saying? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in England, and I believe in America it's still fairly early morning with you.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, so quite decent. So
Yes,
almost cup of coffee time is perfect. Lovely.
exactly.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about you and your writing process and brilliant. I have orange juice on the side here. And tell us how you came. Have you always written as a child? How did you come to writing?
Well, I have always written, but I didn't know that I was really writing. Um, I wrote stories, but it was more when I became a young mother that I started really writing and writing stories and taking different women of the Bible and started writing their stories in a way that people could relate to them. But when I was in seventh grade, I wrote a story about looking inside of a window. It was an assignment that our English teacher gave to us. So everybody picked a window that they looked inside and they wrote a story of what they saw was inside the window.
Hmm.
And I wrote a story about my own life. It was kind of like a way to get to be heard of what was going on in my house,
Hmm.
but yet in a way that hopefully nobody knew that it was my window.
Sure.
So when I wrote the story, she graded it and she handed it to me a couple weeks later, and she called me into her office. She asked me, Bambi, can you come into my office after class? So I didn't know why. I thought, oh my goodness, she knew who it was. She knew it was my window. And so I thought she was going to talk about that. And when I went into her office, she sat me down and she said, I just want you to know that you have a gift. And someday you are going to represent this school as being an author and never stop
Wow.
writing. And I didn't really know about positive reinforcement. I didn't
Hmm.
grow up with a lot of that in my house. So
Hmm.
um, it didn't register into, my brain and into my mind until I was in
Hmm.
my early 20s. And that came back as I wrote something, and one of my friends said, wow, that's a really good thing. You should do a blog. And at that time, I didn't know what a blog was. And then I
Hmm.
remembered, my English teacher, that she was the first one that spoke into my life and told me that I had a gift to write.
Hmm. Wow. We have a slight delay on the video versus audio, but I'm hoping to fix that in the editing process.
Okay.
So moving on, because you have two books published, um, and the first one, are both of them about your life? I
They
love
are.
I love the cover, and we'll come to covers in a little while, and the subtitle on Amazon. It's just gorgeous. So
Well, thank you.
yes.
I actually did win a gold star on my cover. My daughter did my cover for me. I still own my doll. My doll was given to me when I was a little girl as a Christmas
Mm.
present.
Mhm.
So she is still, sits on a bedpost in my guest bedroom. And all my daughter did was just antique, was antique my doll for me. But I did win a gold mark to put on my books,
Mm.
saying that I have won something. And second, I won silver on my writing, which was so amazing because that was my first book that I ever wrote.
Mm.
I knew that I was going to write a story when I was in my late 20s, but it took 25 years to finally be able to write my story. I think that God
Mm.
wanted me to go through some more things in my life,
Mm.
so my story could be relatable to people. And
Sure.
I really wrote it for the sole purpose because we live in a time now that people are now opening up about, the things that they had gone through. There's like a
Mm.
safe environment now than when we were kids. There was no safe environment. You didn't tell the secrets, of your home.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I wrote my story for the sole purpose that other people would give themselves permission to write their stories, so we can all
Mm.
realize that all of us have walked through something in our life. We all have had
Mm.
storms in our lives, but sometimes we keep them to ourselves until
Mm.
somebody's brave enough to say, I've been through that. So that was the purpose of writing my story, The Journey of Josephine, and how my
Mm.
doll was my security blanket and she helped mend a broken heart.
Wow. And the second book, it follows on from that.
The second book is years ago when I was going, dealing with the trauma and dealing with the brokenness that had happened in my life, and then as a child and as a teenager, and then um, even in my later years. It was for the sole purpose that my counselor asked me, to sit down and just sit in silence and ask God for a word picture of my life. And when
Mm,
I did that, I saw a picture of a heart, and it was the pure heart within inside of our bodies. And it was beating, but in there were like little slots and little bows attached to all these little slots. And I began to realize that those were the gifts that God had given to me in the midst of the storms. That even though
mm,
there were things happening in my life, there were treasures. And the purpose of this book was to show people that we all go through storms, but if we sit and we reflect on the storms that
mm,
we have gone through, we
mm,
could realize that we learned more lessons in the storms and we received more gifts in the
mm,
storms. So that was
mm,
the purpose of this book, was to
mm,
get people to understand that we're all going to have storms, but let's look beyond the storms and let's look at the lessons and
mm,
let's look at the treasures. So that
mm,
book is I think there's 25 different treasures that God had given to me throughout, my life. And I know that there's more
mm,
treasures because there's more life,
mm,
for me to live. But it was so people would begin to start seeing things for with the cup, um, full instead of half empty, that there's always lemons, but there's lemonades. There's always storms, but yet there's rainbows. So that was the purpose
yeah,
of the treasures of
yeah,
my heart.
yeah. Because we do learn from the tough times, don't we? It does. They say it makes us stronger.
Yes, and I think we learn
Mm,
more through the tough times,
mm,
and then when we learn those lessons, it's kind of like when they always say, the mountaintop experiences, are breathtaking. But what
mm,
people don't understand when they say stuff like that, that person had to climb that mountain. That person had to endure that mountain. That person had to
mm,
sweat through that mountain. And
mm,
then they were able to enjoy, the horizons. But
mm,
nothing comes easy. Nothing comes
mm,
in our lives simple. It always seems when we have a dream or a vision or something that we
mm,
want to do or a project, there's some
mm.
work that has to be, into
Yeah,
that. And
yeah,
that sweat and the dirt and the grime,
mm,
that's what builds us. That's what builds our
mm,
character. That's what builds our integrity. And
yeah,
that's what builds our dreams to come true.
sure. Well, I always say that, I have quite a charmed life, but even an easy life isn't an easy life,
No,
really.
they all come with
Always
challenges.
obstacles. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So once you'd written the first book, did you do a lot of going back to it and changing it, editing it before you felt it was ready to go out in the world?
I had no idea how to write a book. I had no idea what to do. But every day, I wrote my book. It only took me 3.5 weeks to write my book because it took me
Wow.
54 years to live it.
Sure.
So I already knew.
Yeah.
But every day,
Yeah.
whenever I could, chances that I had, I would go
Mm,
to a beach, in our area, and I
mm,
would take my phone and I opened up Notes, the app Notes, and
mhm,
I would then start recording and start
mm,
talking and
mm,
telling my story. And then I would come back home. I'd call one of my girlfriends that had encouraged me to write my story, and and I would read it to her, and then I would put it on Google Docs. I had no idea the process. I just thought you write a book and you get published and that
it
was
goes
it.
up and yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't, I didn't comprehend the whole thing because I never learned, anything like that. So
Mm,
I had just started praying and asking, who can I get to edit my book? I called one of my girlfriends. I said, I'm not sure why I'm calling you, but would you like to edit my book? I didn't know the different editing styles. I didn't know grammar styles or anything like that. And
mm,
and she said, yeah, I'll edit your book. So
yeah,
she did all the editing. She would call me and tell me things because I just didn't know what I was doing.
sure.
And then I did self-publish it because once again, the process is that,
Mm,
you don't know the process until you have to walk through it.
no, and it's a big
Um,
learning curve.
it's
Self-publishing,
such
it's
a
a big
big
learning curve. Yeah.
it's such a big learning curve, but I had been
Mm,
told that publishers now they're over and dated. Sometimes they don't look at your book for 2
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
Then you get cancellations, or no, this your book's not ready, and stuff like
Mm,
that. And I
yeah.
don't think that I could have handled all that rejection at that time.
Mm,
I think that I just, because my story was so personal and my story was
yeah.
so raw, that
Yeah.
I so to publish it myself, it gave me a real sense of an accomplishment,
Mm,
and a sense that, it was something worth writing, and it was something
mm,
worth publishing, that I could call it that it was my baby.
yeah. And I think especially for your book, you have the control of it. It's the control stays with you rather than the whole process, as you say, because you might get your book accepted and then it goes through the sales and marketing processes and then they might say no. And you
Yes.
never know, and you don't know, depending on which publisher you're with, how much input you have with the cover, with the title. You may even change the title, and so whereas with the joy of self-publishing, yes, it's a lot of work, um, but you do get to decide how you want it to look ultimately.
Absolutely.
Mm,
And it was something that it was my raw life story. So
yeah.
I didn't want anybody to change it because it was mine. And
Mm,
the purpose of writing it is so you could write yours. I
yes.
wanted it to be a tool that women become brave and courageous enough to get out of the closet to be able to tell their stories.
Mm,
So it
mm,
wasn't about, making millions. It wasn't about,
mm,
having somebody else critique it and try to change it. The
mm,
name of the book was designed purposely, so I didn't want anybody to change it, because I wanted it, first of all, I wanted it to heal me.
mm.
And then I wanted it to go out, to help heal others. Because I
Sure.
remember when I got my book, I sat on my bed for 6 hours and I read it all the way through and cried like a baby, and just
Oh.
remembered some of the things that I wrote. And then
Mm,
after I was done writing it and after I was done reading it, I closed the book and I realized I didn't know that girl anymore, because
mm,
I had healed and I had been set free and I had gone
mm,
through, not that I'm perfect and not that I don't have more healing to do,
mm.
but the rawness of my story. I didn't know
Yeah.
her,
Mhm,
because this was a broken person,
mm,
and I had been on the journey of healing. So I
mm,
knew, and I had to go through, the years of the brokenness and not writing my book, because I needed to make
mm.
sure that when people read my book, they didn't read resentment, they didn't read
Sure.
unforgiveness, they didn't,
Yeah.
so I had to work through that myself, so it could be a
Mm,
healing tool,
mm,
for other people to be able to write their
mm.
story.
Yeah. And presumably, there would be, because it's quite therapeutic to write fiction and sort of almost imagine that some of your characters are people you don't like. Whereas if you're writing fact, there must be some therapy to A, getting it down on paper or on a screen, and then giving it to your friend, which is a huge trust, to trust her with all that information, and then to get it back and finalize it and to get it down on paper. It's almost like you can close a chapter because it's now in print. You can close that chapter of your life and move on.
Absolutely. And now it becomes a chapter in somebody else's life, because as
Mm,
authors, we don't write for ourselves. We write
mm,
for an audience. We
mm,
write for people that are behind us. It's not like
mm,
an author picks up their book all the time and reads their own story. We want others to read it. We write
mm.
it for others. And
Absolutely.
so I think about the fact that all I was doing was plowing the field for the next person behind me, and
Mm,
that my story became somebody else's first aid kit.
mm,
And in fact, it was so funny that somebody, I had said that one time, and my daughter's actually making t-shirts, for me to sell, that says my story, your first aid kit. Because that's
mm,
what it is. The more that we tell our stories, the more that other people, are brave, the more that
mm,
other people say,
mm,
wow, I'm not the only one. But
mm,
somebody has to be brave enough to tell their story
yeah.
so others can. Somebody
Mm,
has to plow the field in order for the seeds to be planted. And
mm,
so that's how I look at my book, The Journey of Josephine, is it was a seed that was being planted into somebody else's life.
mm. I think it's come at the perfect time because I'm often saying how, yes, life in a way has got tougher over the years. There's more going on in the world that isn't great, but I think people can be now who they really want to be. Mm,
Absolutely, because, when
mm,
we were kids, you never told the secrets of your home. You
mm,
kept that so silent. So even when you went to school, I had told somebody when I had, done a speaking engagement on my book, I said, "I always felt that I lived in a snow globe and that I
mm,
watched everybody else around me live life,
mm,
but I was
mm,
so stuck in my own home and in my own brokenness and in my own
mm,
trauma within my
mm,
home life that
mm,
I didn't realize, I would have never realized until I wrote my book. And, when I was a kid, I was very bullied. I have a different name.
mm,
Um, and that name wasn't a nice name when I was a kid until I realized what my name meant. But people bullied me. We were a very poor family. We didn't
mm,
have a lot of money. My mom was a single mom. My dad and my mom split up when I was a little girl because my dad was an alcoholic. He wasn't a nice alcoholic. And
mm,
so some of that is written in my book. And when I had my launch party, I had 65 people that showed up to my launch party. And some of them were kids, women that I went to school with. And the reason why they came is because they wanted to tell me that they were sorry for how they
yes.
treated me. But then I
Mm,
realized listening to their stories, they were just as much living in a globe as I
mm,
was
mm,
because you never told your secrets. And
no.
so now we do live in a time period that we can't, I think that we've gone to an extreme, in some aspects,
Mm,
and there's going to be a pendulum, that we're going to meet in the middle. But we
right.
were brought up, you don't tell a single soul. And now kids today, you tell everything. So there
Mm,
needs to be a balance.
mm,
But in me telling my story, I realized even my classmates that they had it tough too, that I wasn't the only one.
yeah, yeah. Because I think regardless of whether a book is fiction or non-fiction, you do you see aspects of your own life as a reader where it helps you. It obviously is going to be entertaining and informing, um, but I think you get to the end of a book and hopefully by the end, regardless of what the book is, you feel better about something. You either even if it's a fictional character who's overcome a particular hurdle, I think in any book there is some relatability um, between what you've just read in your own life. And if
Oh,
it helps you in any way, it's can only be a good thing.
absolutely, and I think that's even that way about people in our lives. I don't
Mm,
believe that we meet people by accident.
mm,
I believe that it is ordained. There's something that I need to learn from you, and there's something that you need to learn from me. It's no
mm,
mistake that we're having this conversation today. So it's not even about writing, it's about everyday life.
mm,
It's the people that we encounter, and it's the people that we minister to. It's the people that we are willing to sit down and talk about our books or
mm,
talk about our stories. you
mm,
know, People transform people. And, communities, that's why we weren't created to be an island. We were
mm,
created to be a community because we need each other.
yeah,
I need some of your wisdom just as much as you need some of my wisdom. And I
mm,
and I think that that's even when we think about it, I think that that's what even like the pandemic did. The pandemic took that community away
mm,
from us, and we
mm,
didn't know how to function all by ourselves because we're not
mm,
islands.
mm,
It took away the communication, it took away the gathering. And I
mm,
think that that's why as a world, we
mm,
are suffering to a point of loneliness, and we're trying to get back to that
mm,
community again
mm,
because we need community, we need conversation, we
mm,
need people, and
mm,
we have a long ways to go from that being taken away from us,
mm,
as the whole world
yeah.
was affected by it.
Yeah. Well, I think it worked in two ways because I love the fact that communities came together because we were all going through exactly the same thing. And although we weren't able to see people in real life, there was a lady who I met, and the likes of Facebook and so on. There was a lady I could travel to my mother to feed her. That was allowed, but we were 2 counties away, an hour away from each other, and I swapped actually with a lady who took my mother food, and then I took her mother food because her mother happened to live a mile away from me, or a couple of miles away from me. So we were able to do that, and people really rallied round people they didn't know, which was
Yeah,
lovely. And then that seemed to, I was sort of fairly hopeful that that would continue thereafter, and it has to a point. But I think it's very easy to forget, and you just get back to your normal life and forget that Ethel down the road is on her own, and she'd like to see somebody.
absolutely, and we
Mm,
need community, we need that.
mm,
That's how we function. We even if you're an introvert, you still need somebody.
yeah.
And I do hope that we get back to locking arms with each other, and the more, that
Mm,
people are willing to tell their stories and willing to
mm,
open up, I
mm,
think that it will come back. I think that we
mm,
will continue to lock arms and
mm,
say, "I've been there, you've been there, let's do the rest together."
mm, mm. Do you as a reader, do you read fiction? Would you consider writing fiction?
I Somebody asked me that, and I don't know, like, it's kinda scares me.
Right. Because I
To me.
say to my students that fiction really is just something you've created the person, you've put them up the tree and you're throwing rocks at them. So it all has to be relatable. The start, middle, end and the plot, even though you don't know that person you've created, it still has to be a relatable. They get into a situation or are put in a situation, and by the end of it, you hope that they've got themselves out of it.
And I somewhat like I am writing a third book, and it's some of it's being edited now. And what I've
Mm,
done, and I've taken 29 different women of the Bible, and I've
mhm,
told their stories, but in a way that they're relatable today.
mhm,
So I've told them from there's a story of a mother named Jochebed, which was Moses' mother, and I told it
okay.
from the point of view of a mother having to give their child up for adoption.
Mm.
So instead of just telling the story, oh, she put him in a basket, and we only
Mm,
hear that. But
yeah,
let's talk about the depth of what it was for a
yes,
mother that loved her
yes, to do
child so much, but she had to give her child up for adoption.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so and adoption comes from pain, because
mm,
one person can't have a child, one person did have a child, and then there's a
mm,
child, and now there's a child that's caught in the middle of these
mm,
two painful families
mm,
that that can or can't have children. So I
mm,
told her story from the point of view of an adopted, a mother that had to give up her child. So in a
mm,
way, I told the truth, but in the way I added, things so people felt the depth,
sure,
of Jochebed.
yeah,
I told the story of Lot's wife. She was the one that turned back and she turned into a pillar of salt.
mm,
But you only hear that. You only hear, okay, she disobeyed and she turned into a pillar of salt. But
mm,
then when you look at it from a mother's point of view, she had 4 daughters, and 2 of those daughters were left behind in Sodom and Gomorrah. So,
right,
what mother, even though she disobeyed God, let's say, but
mm,
what mother wouldn't turn around
mm,
and want to see if her 2
mm,
other children were, coming, or if
sure,
she had grandchildren, what mother? So I told it
mm,
from the point of view of empathy,
mm,
of, we're just hearing, "Oh, Lot's wife did this," and she's
mm,
not even given a name, but
right,
yet she was a mother.
yeah,
So what mother wouldn't have that? So I
mm,
told the story through the empathy part, the point of view of,
mm,
let's lock arms again with mothers and look at us in the painful journey that we've had to go through in motherhood,
mm,
and the
mm,
broken pieces, sometimes of our children, but yet they say one word to us, and that's awesome, and all the pieces are back together again.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
wanted to tell the stories of the women of the Bible in a way that we could relate,
mm,
to them. So that's my
yeah,
third book that I'm
okay,
writing, right now.
yeah. do you have endless books you could write, do you think?
What
Delving
author
deeper?
doesn't? What
Right.
author doesn't?
Yeah. But
You
you're
know,
obviously
you're crossing
you're cle
over. Yeah.
you're I was gonna say you're clearly loving what you're doing.
And I wish I could do it. I am a single mom, of 6 adult children. I live by
Mm,
myself. I'm
mm,
not married. I don't plan on being married again.
mm,
So I would love to write all the time, but also I have to have a job, because
right.
it's me,
Sure.
myself, and I. So
Yeah.
that's like the fear of now that I'm at an age that I want my dreams to come to fruition. And now that I'm becoming who I was supposed to, becoming, I think that women,
Mm,
in our 40s and our 50s, we show up for ourselves.
mm,
Um, but then when we show up for ourselves, we're like, we have so many things and dreams that we want to accomplish because for so long we were part of everybody else's life.
sure.
And now we get to be ours. So if I could, I don't know, I don't play the lottery, but if I could play the lottery and win,
Mm,
$1 million,
yeah.
I
You
could stay home and be
you
able to
can
write.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I
Well,
think that every
hopefully.
woman, every author, you die if you're not writing.
Yeah. Well, I
Every
think
author has it.
yeah. I think Isaac Asimov, sci-fi writer, is quoted as saying that I write for the same reason I breathe, because I have to. And
I just read that quote just recently,
okay. Yeah, I
so
can't
that
remember it verbatim, but
but yeah,
yeah.
it was along those lines. Is yeah, it's
Mm,
part of who you are. And now
yeah.
that I finally, I've been writing blogs and I've been writing stories on Facebook and
Mm,
encouragement, but now that you
mm,
finally put a pen to a paper and it's become a hardcover book, you're
mm,
like, and authors don't write because we're going to make millions of dollars. That's like
mm,
1%. It's kind of like football players,
yeah.
in school. Only 1% of people are going to make it, to being on a football team.
Sure.
Authors don't write to make money. Authors
No.
write because we need to breathe, and authors have something that they
Yeah.
want to say.
And we hope to be read. See, I write to be read, and I'd much rather. Yes, it would be lovely to make a living out of it, but you kind of think. I gave a book. I did had a table at a library once, and there were a few of us, a collective, when I lived further north, and there was a lady who came up, and I'd changed the cover on some of my workbooks, and or short story collections. They're in two at the moment, but they were in eight originally. And she came, and I changed the covers, so I was selling them for £2 each, so making a loss. And she said, "Oh, I'd really love to have one of these, and because I've stopped reading, and I think I might be able to manage a short story, but I have no job and I have no money, and I have to go to the supermarket and buy food." And I said, I'm sure she was truthful, but even if she was exaggerating, I gave her a book so that in the hope that I never learned whether it worked or not, but I gave her one of my books, um, in the hope that it would get her back reading, because they were very short. She said she didn't have she couldn't concentrate on a whole novel and retain all the information. And that's the thing I love about short stories, is that you can do them in as a writer and a reader in one
Yeah,
go.
absolutely. And you
Mm,
planted seeds, and that's what it's about. I didn't
mm,
write my book to make money. Yes, of course, I would love to,
yeah.
but I wrote it, as an avenue to be able to speak life into wounded women.
Mm,
I wrote it as an avenue to be able to speak life, and to show women that we aren't what we lived through.
mm,
We are who we become for what we have lived through.
mm.
We
Yes.
all have gone through stuff in our lives, but it's what we do with that stuff.
Mm,
And so I wanted to write and to be able to pass it on to women, to have the courage and the bravery to
mm.
say, yes, I can. You know, she did it. I can too. So, yeah, writing is
Absolutely.
therapeutic for us. And
Yeah.
just like I said, the first time that I read my book, I was able to close it and say, wow, I don't know that woman anymore, but I sure do
Mm,
want to hug her.
mm,
So I've been able to hug, all these women that have read my book
mm,
because they have found inspiration. So
mm.
yeah, our books are hugs.
Yeah.
Our books are gifts,
Yeah. Yeah.
our books are umbrellas in the midst of the
Mm.
storms.
And it is all about the people. Whenever I teach, I ask a basic question: character, setting, and plot. Which is the most important? And it obviously differs as a writer. You might enjoy writing the plot more, but I think as 99% probably of readers would say the character is the most. Yes, there needs to be a plot there, but the character is the most important thing, because if you've got a character you don't relate to or you don't enjoy, and especially a main character, the goody, the protagonist, if you don't care what happens to them, then you don't carry on reading. You've got to care, and regardless of whether it's a fiction or non-fiction, it is all about the character, isn't it?
And I had just somebody had written, a friend of mine, she's 70 years old. Well, she's 80 and she started writing at 70.
Mm,
And so she has 3 books out. And I had read two of her books. And we went out to dinner together and she said, what did you think of, what did you think of my books? And one thing that I
mm,
said, if I don't have an emotion to a book, it's not a good book to me.
yeah.
It is just what it is. If I don't cry a little bit, or feel the emotion or feel the intensity, then it's
Mm,
not a good book to me.
mm,
That's just the way that my brain works. And I told her first book, and she goes, "I really want you to be honest." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Your first book, I cried through the whole entire thing."
wow.
Even though she was an older woman, and I think that sometimes I'm finding my generation. Is different, that we don't use a lot of adjectives. We don't describe things over and over again. And I found that I've gone to writing groups with older people, and they seem to describe over and over. They use adjectives over and over again. And sometimes you've agitated
Mm,
the rose,
mm,
it's kind of thing. So I told her she did do that. But her second book, I said it didn't give me that same, kind of
mm,
emotion. I'd give you a
mm,
10, absolutely, on your first book. Your second
wow.
book, it was, a 7 because it didn't bring emotion to me. And she
Mm,
kind of was upset with me because of the fact that I said I review books on emotion. And she said, "You
mm,
can't review a book on emotion." And I said, "But that's what I do. So I give your second book a 7."
mm.
And she kind of like didn't like that. So I was like, I thought it was a pretty good thing,
Yeah.
but it just didn't captivate me. And
Yes.
some books captivate you and some books just don't.
Mm,
So some you read again and others you just put on a
mm.
shelf
But
or bring it to.
it sounds like she got over it if she's still writing 10 years, another 10 years later, and did you
Yeah,
say
and
she
she's
has
an
3 books?
Yes, and she's a good now she's painting more,
Okay.
but I mean, for me, she was 70 years old and wrote her first book. That gives me encouragement as 50
Right.
I'm 55,
Right.
and so I still have a whole lot more writing to do.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's the great thing about it. You have a pen and paper, or I use notes and the dictaphone as well, and I'm
Oh,
forever
really?
for
Okay.
yeah, yeah, it's fabulous, and it doesn't always come out how you read, and I think I have quite an understandable accent, but it often comes out with weird and wonderful things. But it's there on paper, and I have a Gmail account. And so you can actually access, if you have a Gmail account and hook the notes up to it, you can access it via your emails. And so you can just, if it's a long-winded thing, you can copy and paste it from your email. There's another
I didn't
conversation.
even know. Okay, well, that's
Yeah,
kind of cool to know. But yeah,
yeah,
you're right. When you're writing something and you're reading it back and go, "I didn't say that.
yeah,
There's no way I said
yeah,
I didn't
yeah,
say that at all."
yeah, yeah.
My children even tell me that when I text message them and stuff. They're like,
Right.
"Mom, did you read what you wrote to us?" "No, I
Yeah,
just pushed send." "No,
yeah.
Mom, you need to read what you wrote."
Okay, yeah. I'm one of these who edits my text messages before I hit send, especially my family and in-laws, because they all know I'm an editor. So I have had things slip through the net, and they kind of, you can almost see their eyes rolling, as I should have known better.
Yeah, my children roll their eyes because they say, they roll their eyes only because I didn't know better, but I should have.
Right. Mm. It sounds like they're incredibly supportive of you and your writing.
um, at least I have 6 children and they're supportive, but really 2 are very supportive. My daughter that helps me with my covers,
Mm,
and she does my gets my, business cards and, sets up things for me. My
mm,
son actually did my website for me because there would be no way in God's creation that I could have ever set up a website.
right.
Um, and he set it up for me and did a great job. So he
Yeah.
supported me in that way. And they're excited because they know that it's my dream and I've always wanted to
Mm,
write. Um, Only 2 of my children have read, my books. The other 4 just said that they just didn't want to read about their mom,
sure.
and read about the
Yeah.
things, even
'Cause
though
it's
they know some
traumatic.
things. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
traumatic. And
Yeah.
then but the 2 that did read it, one said, "Wow, I'm picturing you not as my mom, but as a little girl." And
Mm,
it made me cry, and then I realized, "Oh my goodness, we're talking about my mother here."
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was really tough, and some of
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
about them and things like that. So
Mm,
someday the other ones will read it, and that's fine. It's their own journey. They have their own journey that
mm,
they have to go on just as
sure.
much as I have my own journey. But
Yeah.
2
Yeah.
really do support me, more than the other 4.
Mm,
And that's okay.
brilliant. Brilliant. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll come back again in the not too distant future and talk more detail about your first book.
Well, thank you so much. And this was a lot of
You're
fun.
very welcome. Thank you. Thank you. For me too. Always a pleasure. I say that I'll go to the opening of an envelope if it's got writing on it, so I can literally talk about writing all day. No
That's
problem at all.
awesome.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you again. All
All
right.
right. Take care.
Bye bye.